Hello, my name is Beck and I am the Engagement Manager at Greenfleet. We're going to be joined shortly by Wayne, our CEO, who's going to have a chat to us about what's happened in COP26 in the last few days. So I'm just going to get Wayne to join us. One of the things that we've really noticed over the last couple of days is the increase in discussion of fuels and coal use. And so we want to have a talk about what that means, particularly for Australia. So once Wayne is joining, firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are coming from Wurundjeri country today in Melbourne. And we acknowledge that the Wurundjeri people are the traditional owners of this land and pay respects to their elders, both past and present, and particularly to anyone who might be joining us
I'm very
today.
well, thank you, Beck.
So,
Nice
Wayne,
to
how
see
are you?
this morning?
You too. So we're coming to the end of the first week of COP26 in Glasgow. And the last couple of days, the discussion around coal and fossil fuels has increased. So can you tell us a little bit about the discussions and what's
So it's
happening in
very
regards to
interesting,
that?
isn't it? Because I think, as you know, I've been involved in COPs for many years, having attended COP4, so which gives you a sense of how old I actually am. But one of the great structural things that our global community has to do is move away from legacy fossil fuel-based energy systems. We all know this. This has been a constant theme for many years in the environment movement, which I've been a part of all my life. Very honed to climate change. So how do we move from the wonderful benefits that these legacy fossil fuels systems have given us in terms of power and development, and there's no denying that, but the terrible devastation they've made and continue to have on our climate. So moving from that is really important. At each COP, there's always been battles around this. This is the first COP where we've had recently a number of countries. The number keeps changing, so I can't really lock it down whether it's 27, 40 or 200, which I didn't know there were 200 countries, but there's a lot of different numbers being used to focus on the idea of getting rid of coal totally, exiting coal by 2030 for developed countries, and by 2040 for developing countries. Now that's an old structural fault as well, which also has raised its ugly head again, and is always part of the deal. So that's a bit of detail there, Beck, but I think it's important to understand what we're seeing is how does a global community try to change the way it deals with energy systems. You've got the big legacy systems, as I say, coal is the big focus for all of us because that is the dominant player. But I should add in, this raises the issue of nuclear energy as well. That's commonly a debate that starts flowing when we start talking about these energy systems as well. So there was a strong push to declare this, and this is the first time I've seen this, which is fabulous. But Australia, US, China, and India, for example, weren't part of that, and they're massive parts of the coal economy globally. What I think we're seeing here is a pretty strong push by countries that know they're vulnerable, a push by countries that perhaps have less to lose than some of those major countries, but a fairly determined conversation. So I think that's a big shift. So it's a good shift. So it's good that the COP is now talking about coal as let's exit from coal. Okay. Now, just so we know, we're clear, that's the intellectual framework. We need to move from coal. What do we move to? Obviously, renewables. Australia already is well placed to do this. It's a madness, a total madness that our country hasn't promoted this stronger, given our competitive advantage in this area. We are now getting a push around green hydrogen, all power to it as well, to use a pun there. But I think it's important that we recognise that the decision is always much more than the intellectual framework. So we know we need to move from coal to renewables, but we know, that developing countries and in particular are still, and India is probably the classic example, is still very focused on trying to lift its population out of poverty and see cheap power as important. And that's pretty devastating contradiction to have to deal with, right? And No one wants to be on either side of that debate. We want to be able to lift those people out of poverty, but not continue to damage the climate the way we have been these last couple of 100 years. And secondly, there's the legacies, even in countries like Australia. We know, don't we, we've had this debate, that we have communities in our country that have developed around coal mining. And the truth is that, you know, I live in inner city Melbourne, and for me, I don't have that direct impact on me, my livelihood, my community. It does have an impact elsewhere. Now, I don't think that's unsolvable. I don't think it is. I think we can do this, but it has to have a much more creative and long-term view than we've ever had. You know, why didn't we start this 20 years ago when we knew this was a problem? So I think we're creating, you know, it's the old issue of our species works best under crisis. Now, stop me, Becky, if I get too philosophical here on a Friday morning, but our species, we tend to wait until the heart attack before we change the way we eat or we start exercising. We all know what we should be eating and what we should be moving and exercising, but we wait till we have a health problem before we do it. That's a general comment. Of course, many people don't. I think with countries, what we're seeing in Australia is we're waiting for the crisis. We're waiting for this to become impossible to deal with, the climate becoming so difficult, the global climate having moved, and the global population, the global countries having moved and forcing us, as they clearly are, forcing Australia with, and now the laggard, to do this under crisis, rather than having planned over the last 20 years, carefully moved our way along. And here's an exemplar story. We do a bit of work up in Bundaberg, as probably some of our viewers know. We've done this beautiful project up there helping to protect turtles at Monrepo near Bundaberg, a project of which I'm very proud. Bundaberg is also an area that usually gets something like 10 to 15%, I'm pretty sure, One Nation support. So it's a I would say, has some serious socio-economic issues and feels quite disempowered. And there's no judgment on that. That's just the way it is. But, you know, it also has more solar panels than anywhere else in the country. So the truth is, this is not about culture wars, as so often we hear. This is about just effectiveness. And we know that solar panels work really well in a lot of places in the country. So we know that we should be moving to new forms of energy. We know that we can make this happen, but we have been really lax in doing that. So I think COP has refocused that question. Whether it will be practically able to do anything in any meaningful sense, Beck, I don't know, because I think a second thought, if you're okay for me to proceed to a second thought, is that, I mean, clearly there has been a lot of work done on deforestation, and you probably read that there's a big push to end deforestation, indeed by 2030 again. But Indonesia has now come out. There's a big debate going on in the politics, internal political circles within Indonesia about whether that's possible or not. And as you possibly know, there's been global declarations on deforestation for many years. So this is, again, a massive issue. Of course, Greenfleet doesn't want to see the great work that our supporters do in helping us to rebuild ecosystems around the country to be undermined by deforestation. And we still have that happening in this country, outrageously, in Queensland and New South Wales in particular. So I think that's the second issue that has been highlighted over the first week of COP, which is how do we deal with deforestation in a way that's a bit more creative. And Indonesia is really saying we're not seeing the funding mechanisms, although I think there are billions of dollars going to this, but there's a lot of promises and maybe not a lot of execution. So I think that's the second point. Does that make sense? And look, I think just it might be worthwhile for those of us for those of you who are watching this to hear that, you know, kind of interestingly, we've all talked a lot about the economy bouncing back after COVID. You know, it happened last year after the first wave, and it's happening again. It's going to happen again this time. The underpinning thing that's not so good about that is that our emissions, which dropped last year, are coming back, roaring back now. And this is a real challenge for us because, so I think what we're seeing is, and this is possibly the political context that the leaders are talking about, is that, you know, 2050 net zero, or that's a and absolutely lay down misère. That has to be a global commitment, even though we know India is pushing that out to 2070. And the focus now is all about 2030, as we know, and that's as it should be. What are we going to do this decade? But I think we're going to be faced for the next couple of years with a massive increase in emissions. So even more importantly now, to double down on the transition strategies, and that is clearly carbon offsetting, is going to be even more important this decade than previously thought. We have to be sequestering these emissions. We have to be getting on the front foot. What I don't want us all to do is say, you know what, it's all hopeless, we can't do it. Let them just get on with it. We can take action, and also we should be dramatically increasing the amount of renewables, electric vehicles in particular, the connection with solar panels, batteries, that whole electrification of our households and our buildings is all very, very possible, and will save money. So I think the third point I wanted to make, so we talked about coal, we talked about deforestation. I think the third one really is this resurgence in emissions means for me that we have to refocus our efforts even harder this decade. And I'll be going back to our board after this COP saying we need to lift our game even harder and think about how we can scale up the work that we do with our supporters right now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Wayne. One of the points you touched on Wednesday when we discussed COP was that offsetting is not a license to pollute. And it seems that carbon capture and storage, the technologies around those, that the Australian government in particular is very much relying on in regards to meeting our net zero 50 targets. Can you chat a little bit about why carbon capture is important, but why it's also
I'm not even
the
sure
only
it's
solution.
a solution, Beck. I'm deeply sceptical of this. Is essentially a strategy to keep fossil fuels going for as long as we can. Now, look, if it was all possible, is it a transition strategy? Probably is. But from what I have, and having been involved in this for some time now, I don't see that on the horizon in any economic way at all. I think it's essentially a way for legacy investments to be protected. And I don't want to sniff at that. I mean, that is, many of us will have, hopefully, we've moved our super funds out of coal, fossil fuel shares. But for those of us for the general community, that's going to be part of the deal. And I think we're going to have to face the fact that, carbon capture and storage is being heavily promoted by Australia. I deeply resent investment going into that, which should be being directly focused on renewables. We are potentially, with solar and wind and with solar panels, decentralised energy systems like solar panels on rooftops across this nation, large-scale battery installations and EVs, we can break the back of that cycle. And I'm just astonished that we would consider investing billions into carbon capture and storage in what seems to be a last-flung attempt to maintain legacy. So I'm not interested at all, and I think it's a really poor strategy. I think it's born out of a defensive strategy around fossil fuels, not out of what's our best way to reduce our emissions and to manage the transition to a low-carbon economy through the rest of this century. How do we get there? I think carbon capture and storage is one that, if it has a role to play, which I doubt, if it does, I think it should be funded by the private sector and keep the government out. I think the government should be focusing on clearly the area which is both supported by individuals, has the biggest electrification through renewables, with all the issues we know that will raise, but which are fundamentally much closer to being able to be managed than carbon capture storage.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights again with us, Wayne. We'll be chatting on Monday about developments that will happen throughout the day today, and again on Wednesday and Friday next week to round out the conference. Is there anything else you'd like to
I'm sure people are probably swamped like I am by COP. COP commentary. Maybe that's a new thing that's happened. COP commentary, which I sadly am part of now. So I apologise adding to the noise. But so it's very hard to work it out. But I personally am really interested in anyone who's listening to this in connecting back to us, asking any questions, disagreeing, if you will, but also suggesting areas that we can talk about. You know, in the liberal democracies, we have to keep this conversation going. It's very hard when you're overwhelmed by social media and the spin from all the different advocates of all the vested interests. You know, and I think if we maintain our view on a sort of a general good spirit and hopefulness that we can come through this, I think that's probably the only attitude we can have. But it's pretty hard to do it at the moment, I have to say. So I'm hoping that in the next week we have grounds for hope, further hope, and maybe even better, a bit of optimism that we could come out of this. You know, the sort of optimism. I was in Paris when that agreement was reached, and there was an incredible feeling of, wow, we're moving forward at last. And to be honest, I don't think that's happened. So I think it's important that Glasgow people come out of that, not as a spun result, but that it's a result that genuinely makes us all feel, okay, there's a transition. It's not going to be easy. It's going to cost money. But, you know, for our grandkids and our grandkids and all the rest, we need to go through this, and we've got to do this. My generation has failed dramatically in this so far. So I'm hoping that Glasgow can be a step forward in that as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think climate hope is definitely what we need at the moment. It can be quite overwhelming when we've got all the news coming at us about how dire the situation is. So let's hope that the next does bring some optimism for us.
Okay, right. See you on Monday.
Thanks, Wayne.
Have a good weekend.
I'll catch you on Monday.
Everyone. See ya.
You too.